This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Writer Life. Today it's not going to be as long an episode as normal because as you can see by the title of this week's episode, it's called A Tribute to a Life. And I want to do something a little bit different and a little bit extra special today, as I want to focus on remembering what was a very significant aspect of my life and something that had a deep impact on my life as a writer. And so it's not the easiest of times for me at the moment, and as you will find out as I go through this. And so I just wanted to do this as a lasting tribute to someone who is incredibly special in my life. In 2013, on November the 21st, I got the call that informed me that somebody very important in my life had been taken away from me, as I lost my stepmom. And my mum had battled cancer on and off for years, so in a way, the phone call was not unexpected. And yet that call was the moment that I'd been dreading. And even though I was actually prepared for it, it was still incredibly devastating to hear the news as my father called me in tears to let me know that my mother had passed away that morning. It was an intensely difficult time, as I had to try and understand why somebody so full of life and spirituality would be taken away. And I had to face the reality of knowing I would never hear her laughter or see her wonderful smile again. And it really did for me personally. It absolutely felt like the end of the world. I cannot deny I struggled over the weeks that followed. I found it hard to focus on my writing, as everything in my life felt 100 times much harder to do, as I had this huge ball of pain that was trapped inside me, and I really could not find any way of quelling it or releasing it. My grief was incredibly private. I held it all in, and I did my best to try and be as supportive to my father and those around me as I possibly could. Because, in many ways, she was not just my mum. She was a mum to my wife and a really superb grandmother to my two very, very young children at that time. One of the most difficult things at that time was actually trying to tell my children, because she was a huge part of their life. And even though they knew, Granny had been ill for a few long months, they never really thought or expected there would be a moment when they would lose her. And those even now are still some of the most difficult conversations my wife and I have ever had as parents with our children. Now, like all things you have at some point, you've just got to move on. And in all truth, I really did not want to. I didn't want to keep talking about her, because every time I did, I felt this huge knot in my stomach. And, I'm not going to deny, there were times where I was told by other people that I needed to just get over it and move on. And I had all of the usual cliches told to me, such as, Rob, life moves on. Just deal with it and move on, will you? Time does heal all wounds. In all honesty, it felt really, really patronizing. And I was well aware of her loss. I was feeling it daily. And if the truth be told, my silence around her loss was not, me not dealing with it. It was actually how I did deal with it. Because I internalized it all so that I could come to terms with it. And people just did not understand at all. And they judged me by their standards. And they completely disregarded me and my own personal, private, deep inner feelings of pain and loss. And it felt frustrating. It felt difficult, even agonizing at times, because I just wanted them to understand that they needed to leave me alone and let me get on with coming to terms. Now for myself, this was a deeply personal thing, and in a sense my quietness on the issue was just simply my way of fully internalizing it so that I could come fully to terms with her loss and actually accept it. Because when I first lost her, I didn't. There didn't seem to be any justice that someone who did so much for so many and brought such joy to so many lives should be taken away. Now obviously, my dad often spoke of her, and as a poet, he wrote about her in all of his poems. He also wrote long essays, and all of them were absolutely heartbreaking to read because, as a couple, as a married couple, they were so close, so connected. It was obviously how deeply her life had impacted on his life and how deeply his feelings of loss ran. I understood he missed her. I understood how lonely he was. I could not imagine for a moment losing my own wife and then being forced to continue on without her. And so I really did have a good insight. But as well as the others who surrounded me, he too pushed hard at times to get me to open up and talk. And nobody understood. I just couldn't. Because I could not find the words that truly expressed how much her loss meant. And one afternoon, I yet again tried to explain this and tried to make him understand that even though I was a writer, as much as I could probably write it all down, because I was so much better at expressing things when I wrote, I could not actually talk him through what I really wanted to say verbally. I couldn't really remember one afternoon where I could actually feel his frustration. Both of us were getting upset because we were both failing to fully convey our innermost feelings. And I came away from the conversation absolutely tied up in knots and probably feeling worse than I ever had before. My own frustrations of trying to explain my own way of grieving just added yet more pressure and more pain to an already incredibly difficult conversation. I really had no answer for anyone. Hell, even I was struggling with these huge, overwhelming feelings inside me. And I was really down and becoming very depressed, struggling to verbalize what was sat there at my core and trapped deep within me. That night I sat back, having spoken to my wife of my frustrations and talked of how I felt it was like becoming a big wedge between my father and myself. And I really just was at a loss and did not know what was expected of me, because talking about her brought back some of the huge feelings, and I just got upset over and over as the intenseness of it ate away at me. I honestly felt at that time like I was in the world's worst no-win situation. My wife went to bed and she left me sat in the semi-darkness in front of my computer. And I simply stared at it for ages as I tried to really understand why I felt absolutely so resistant. Because as someone who's worked as a counsellor, I did know and fully understood that at some point I'd have to deal with this and actually start coming to terms with it all. One thing that was stuck in my head was something that my wife had said. And as I thought about it more and more, it began a process that gave me a solution. It's daft really, because I already knew, but she simply looked at me and she said, "Rob, everybody deals with it differently. Your dad has got his way. So no matter what, you do it your way." Now it made such sense, and it set my mind on fire, because I sat there thinking of her words that night. The answer actually came to me in a bolt of inspiration. You know, I'm a writer. It's what I do. And so I picked up a pad and I started to scribble down all of the things that I had in common with my mum, all of the things we spoke of, and all of the reasons I felt the world was a better place with her actually in it. I have a file of emails that she sent to me, and so I opened them up and I reread every word she'd written on all of the crazy things that we talked about. And it brought to mind all of our crazy conversations as we walked together on some of our visits up to their house, and all of those private phone conversations where I reached out to her with yet another completely crazy and bonkers idea for my writing. And I read through and remembered all of them. That night, I came to the decision that I would write a new story that was completely based around not only who she was as a person, but who she was to me. The one thing I knew was this was my story. It had to be my own personal insight, my own understanding of her, and a reflection of the love and the joy she brought to my family. So it would be my own personal and private tribute to her. And I really have no idea why, but in that moment, all of what would be the plot came rushing to mind, and I made notes on my laptop of how I wanted to tell my story of this amazing, loving and caring woman. And I've absolutely got no idea why, but I knew in that moment that the book was going to be called Hans Cottage. The book that I wrote is my tribute to her, and every character in the book has a large part of her included in the way in which I created each of them. My lead character was Emily Montgomery Duncan, a young girl who lost her mother aged 4, which was actually the age I was when my own parents separated. And the story would show how her father, John Duncan, had fallen apart and found the death of his wife such a huge struggle that he'd looked to his lost wife's mother for help. And she was Hannah Montgomery, or as Emily knew her, Grandma Han. Emily had been sent to boarding school as a young child, and she'd not had the best of times as she missed her mother and felt like her father no longer wanted her. Her only solace was that on every school holiday she went to stay with Grandma Han, and it was through Han she found a strong connection, and Han's cottage was the only place she saw as her real home. Now, fast forward 16 years, and Emily gets a call in the night shortly before she's going home for the holidays, and she is told the sad news of the passing of her grandmother, and she breaks down and calls the only person she can rely on at that moment. She calls her best friend Shelley. In order to write the book, I took important parts of my mum and I gave them to all of the characters. For Emily, I gave her the same relationship I had with mum. And, I handed that relationship over to her and Han. Now for Shelley, I gave her the spirituality of mum, and her joy and her love I gave to Grandma Hannah. Every character had a part of her persona and beliefs, and because we had so many conversations about all of the magic and fantasy that we used to surround our daughter when she was such a little girl, I decided to take that aspect of our relationship and I created the small fantasy characters that would become the secret part of Han's life. They were the Nairn, or the fairy-like creatures of Esme and Felix. The whole book was absolutely tailored to who she was, what she believed, and how she treated and interacted with those that surrounded her. I added a lot of personal elements that were very private to me, and because in many ways the book was going to be my tribute, and a tribute to a special person, and this became for me a really, really personal project. So there are things in there that only I would recognize, or possibly my wife. It took me 6 years to write Han's Cottage. I really did take my time, and I thought everything through as I dealt with my own feelings, my own expressions, my own ideas. And as I reached each different chapter, I put together not just my experiences of being around her as a stepson, but also how I saw the world without her, and ultimately where I find myself at the end of 6 years worth of very, very private writing. Han's Cottage became the journey of Emily, and all of the feelings and insights she learned on the way through her grief and into hope. And to a degree, it mirrors my own journey. The fantasy element helped lift the pace of the story, and it helped to balance out some of those moments of darkness. And they also, are in a sense, or do in a sense, show part of my own journey, because as Emily has the Nairn to help ease her and comfort her in her life, I also had their story to also play a similar role in my own life. Taking on and returning to the cottage and learning to negotiate the problems that come with Emily's return is to a degree symbolic of me taking on this story that is woven with the fabric of the person that my mum was in my life. The final book, which was published last year, 9 years after her loss, became for me a standalone story that was to a degree a fairy tale for grown-ups. Even though Han's Cottage has the main subject theme of dealing with grief and loss, as I came to the end of the book, having spent 6 years working on it, I could see that it was indeed a book filled with the same beauty of life that my mum encapsulated, and it contained that sparkle and the magic of the person that she was all through her own life. Writing this book became a journey of hope that showed the joy of life and the beauty captured within the human spirit. it does show the full humanity of who we are as people and what all of us are actually capable of, and also how we all contain some form of spiritual energy when we accept life and live in the moment with joy. In all life there is magic. Hell, life in itself is magic. And yet at times we get lost and find it hard to find a direction. But that is fine, as long as we accept that all life is a journey and it does not have to have a specific destination. And all we need to do really is just trust in the process and be open to whatever comes next, and then embrace life in all its chaotic colours and seasons. As the author, I'm very proud of how this book turned out. It's a work of beautiful fantasy throughout and put together with great love, as I literally took all of my feelings from my mum and I poured them into the pages. And as a result, it has touched the heart of all who have read it. The book was actually a big hit with my readers and gained a little short-term notoriety, as the many who read it talked of it so much that their friends even bought copies in order for them to read it as well, which is actually what a good book should do. Since it was published, a lot of those who've read it have asked me if I would write a follow-up to it, and I have considered it. But ultimately, at this point in my life, I'm really not sure I could match it, for it was a tribute to my mum, and I feel that this time to write a second would, to a degree, diminish the point of writing Hans Cottage in the first place. I suppose just like my mum, I do feel this book should be a one-off, never to be replicated, and so I do not see a time where I could continue with Emily's story. Writing this book has helped me to come to terms with something that did darken my life, and it has always been my hope that it would reach out and touch others in a way that brought light to their lives. For at her core, that was the most powerful gift of the person that my mum was. She walked in the light. I think my dad understands that in many ways, others maybe will not. But the book has, to a degree, also added some light to his life, and that really does please me. Because I think now, we finally understand each other so much better. Hans Cottage is a story that is a tribute to a life that was lived. And it was a life that was special and blessed and radiated love and magic to all that encountered it, especially children. In order to write it, I had to face my own personal darkness and look into the shadow that had been cast over my own life. When the book was finished and ready for publication, I decided I was going to dedicate it to her memory, and I wrote a very truth-telling part of that, which simply read, "Maybe we all have to walk through the darkness before we can find our light, and then we must not forget the light, for that is actually the gift of our darkness. Cherishing those we miss the most, for memories of Pat."